When vintage shop owner Isabella Moreau signed the receipt for a dusty estate sale haul that barely covered her monthly rent, she had no idea that a century-old safe buried beneath moth-eaten clothing would expose a $200 million insurance conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. For locked within that weathered steel vault lay evidence of systematic fraud that powerful families had orchestrated for nearly 8 decades, destroying lives and communities while building their financial empires on a foundation of calculated deception. Before we dive deep into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this tale grips you, make sure to hit that subscribe button because the next 9 parts will reveal secrets that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about corporate power in America. The morning sun cast long shadows across Magnolia Street in the historic district of Bellhaven, Louisiana, as Isabella Moreau unlocked the wrought-iron gates of her vintage boutique, Treasures Past. The shop, nestled between a failing bookstore and an antique clock repair business, had been her dream for 5 years and her financial nightmare for the past 2. Isabella, 34, with auburn hair that caught the light streaming through dusty windows and eyes that had learned to spot value in the most unlikely places, surveyed her domain with the mixture of pride and anxiety that had become her daily companion. The shop was beautifully curated, each piece carefully selected and artfully displayed, but beautiful didn't pay the bills. In a world of fast fashion and online shopping, convincing customers to invest in authentic vintage pieces required more charm and persistence than most people possessed. The brass cash register, itself a 1940s antique she'd rescued from a bankruptcy sale, contained exactly $127.43. Her rent was due in 6 days, and Mr. Beauregard, her landlord, had made it clear that his patience had reached its limit. The certified letter sitting unopened on her kitchen counter contained what she was certain were eviction proceedings. "Another day in paradise," Isabella muttered to herself, arranging a display of 1950s handbags that had taken her 3 months to sell even one from. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Margot in Baton Rouge. "Still time to take that job at the insurance office. Steady paycheck, benefits, normal hours." Isabella deleted the message without responding. She'd worked in corporate insurance for 8 years after college, wearing gray suits and processing claims in a windowless cubicle. She'd rather lose everything than return to that suffocating existence, though at this point, losing everything seemed increasingly likely regardless of her preferences. The morning crawled by with only 2 customers, a tourist who photographed several items but bought nothing, and Mrs. Thibodeau, a regular customer who enjoyed browsing but rarely purchased anything above $5. By noon, Isabella had reorganized the jewelry case twice and updated her social media posts with forced enthusiasm she didn't feel. That's when Marcus Chen walked through her door, carrying salvation disguised as obligation. Marcus owned Chen Estate Services, specializing in liquidating the belongings of deceased individuals whose families either couldn't or wouldn't deal with the process themselves. Isabella had worked with him several times over the years, and he'd become one of her most reliable sources for inventory, though his timing today felt almost providentially desperate. "Isabella, I've got something for you," Marcus announced, his usual businesslike demeanor softened by genuine concern. At 45, Marcus had developed an eye for people in trouble, and he could read financial desperation as easily as he could appraise a piece of furniture. "Just finished cleaning out the Whitmore estate on St. Charles Avenue. Big old mansion. Family patriarch died 6 months ago, heirs live in California, and just want everything gone." Isabella tried to look interested rather than desperate. "What kind of pieces are we talking about?" Marcus consulted his tablet. "Mostly clothing from the 1940s through the 1970s, some jewelry, a few pieces of furniture they couldn't be bothered to ship. Nothing spectacular, but decent vintage stuff. The problem is, I need it moved today. The new owners take possession tomorrow morning, and I've got a crew scheduled to haul whatever's left to the dump." The word dump made Isabella's stomach clench. Perfectly good vintage pieces destroyed because of timing and logistics. "What are you asking?" "Here's the thing," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he was about to make her an offer that acknowledged her circumstances without humiliating her. "Normal price would be $1,200 for the lot, but since I need it gone immediately and you'd be doing me a favor by taking it off my hands," he paused, pretending to calculate. "Call it $400, cash." $400. Isabella's mental calculations were swift and brutal. It was money she didn't have, but the retail value of even mediocre vintage clothing could easily triple that investment if she could move it quickly. The gamble was whether she could sell enough pieces fast enough to cover her rent and still have inventory for the future. "I'll take it," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "When can you deliver?" "The truck's loaded and waiting outside," Marcus replied, with a smile. "One more thing, though. There's a safe. Old thing, probably from the 1920s or 1930s. No idea what's in it. Family says they never saw it opened. Might be empty, might have documents, might have valuables. It's heavy as hell, and my guys were going to leave it, but I figured you might want to take a look." Isabella's pulse quickened. Safes from estate sales were always intriguing, filled with the possibility of forgotten treasures or at least interesting historical documents that could add provenance to other pieces. Any idea about the combination? None. The deceased, Charles Whitmore, was 89 and had dementia his last few years. His son in Los Angeles says the old man was always secretive about business, never shared details. They tried a few obvious combinations, birthdays, anniversaries, but no luck. Included in the lot, Isabella decided. At worst, she'd have an interesting conversation piece. At best, who knew what 3/4 of a century might have preserved? Within an hour, Marcus's crew had transformed Isabella's stockroom into a cramped maze of clothing racks, boxes, and furniture pieces. The safe, as promised, was substantial, a black steel Mosler model that probably weighed 300 pounds. It dominated one corner of the stockroom, its brass handle and dial gleaming despite its age. After Marcus and his crew departed, Isabella stood among her new acquisition, simultaneously energized and terrified. She'd just spent money she didn't have on inventory she couldn't afford, gambling her shop's survival on her ability to turn vintage clothing into cash faster than her creditors could close in. But first, the safe. Isabella had always been drawn to mysteries, and the locked vault seemed to pulse with possibilities in the late afternoon light filtering through the stockroom's single window. She tried the obvious combinations Marcus had mentioned: 1934, the year carved into the safe's manufacturing plate; 1932, Charles Whitmore's birth year, according to the estate documents; various arrangements of significant dates. Nothing. As evening approached, Isabella forced herself to focus on the practical necessities. She spent 3 hours sorting through the clothing, separating pieces by era and quality. Most was exactly as Marcus had described, decent vintage wear that would appeal to her customer base. A few pieces were exceptional: a 1940s Schiaparelli jacket that made her heart race, several 1960s Pucci dresses that would command premium prices, a collection of 1950s jewelry that showed real craftsmanship. But her attention kept returning to the safe. Charles Whitmore, according to the documents Marcus had provided, had been a successful insurance adjuster for Crescent City Mutual, one of Louisiana's oldest insurance companies. He'd worked there for 43 years, from 1952 until his retirement in 1995. A long, stable career in a conservative industry, exactly the kind of person who might accumulate valuable documents or modest valuables worth protecting. Isabella's laptop research revealed little additional information. Charles had been married to Dorothy Whitmore for 52 years until her death in 2018. They'd had one son, Michael, who'd moved to California in the 1980s and rarely visited. Charles had been active in several historical societies, particularly those focused on New Orleans' insurance industry and its role in the city's economic development. By 10 p.m., Isabella had to admit defeat for the evening. She'd tried every combination she could think of, from significant dates to numerical patterns. The safe remained stubbornly sealed, keeping its secrets locked away. She was preparing to close the shop when she noticed something she'd missed earlier. Behind a rack of 1960s cocktail dresses, partially hidden by the day's reorganization, was a small wooden filing cabinet that apparently had been included in the estate sale hall. It was nothing spectacular, standard office furniture from perhaps the 1970s, but Isabella's thoroughness compelled her to examine it. The top drawer slid open easily, revealing meticulously organized files that made Isabella's heart sink.
Charles Whitmore had apparently been the kind of man who saved everything. Decades of utility bills, insurance policies, medical records, tax returns, the kind of detailed record-keeping that would take hours to sort through and probably yield nothing of value. But the bottom drawer was different. Inside, Isabella found a collection of materials that seemed oddly curated compared to the routine paperwork above. There were newspaper clippings dating back to the 1940s and 1950s, all related to major fires, floods, and accidents in the New Orleans area, insurance industry newsletters from the same period, and most intriguingly, a leather portfolio labeled Crescent City Mutual Historical Claims. Isabella opened the portfolio with growing curiosity. Inside were photocopied documents, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be internal insurance company memoranda dating from the 1940s through the 1970s. The papers were yellowed but well preserved, suggesting they'd been carefully maintained. The first document was a 1947 internal memo from Crescent City Mutual regarding a warehouse fire in the French Quarter. The fire had destroyed a building owned by the Beaumont family, one of New Orleans' most prominent shipping dynasties. The insurance payout had been substantial for the era, $200,000, equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. What caught Isabella's attention wasn't the payout amount, but the handwritten notes in the margins. Someone, presumably Charles Whitmore based on the handwriting, had written, "Same construction crew as the Treme fire, 1945, and the warehouse on Magnolia Street, 1946. Pattern?"
Isabella flipped through more documents. The Treme fire had also involved a Beaumont property. The Magnolia Street incident had been owned by another prominent family, the Rousseaus. In each case, the insurance payouts had been substantial, and in each case, Charles Whitmore had noted connections that seemed to suggest something beyond coincidence. A 1952 newspaper clipping reported on a major flood that had damaged several Beaumont warehouses near the river. The insurance settlement had been record-breaking for the company. Charles's note read, "Third natural disaster to benefit same family in 5 years. Mathematical probability?" Isabella's pulse quickened as she began to understand what she was looking at. Charles Whitmore hadn't just been an insurance adjuster. He'd been an investigator, quietly documenting what appeared to be a pattern of suspicious claims involving New Orleans' most powerful families. The deeper she dug into the portfolio, the more elaborate the pattern became. Fires, floods, and accidents affecting properties owned by the Beaumonts, Rousseaus, and several other prominent families. Each incident resulting in insurance payouts that far exceeded the apparent value of the damaged property. Each claim processed through Crescent City Mutual with minimal investigation. But most damning were the internal company documents Charles had apparently copied and preserved. Memos discussing preferred clients who received expedited claim processing. Instructions to adjusters to approve certain claims without the usual investigation procedures. References to family considerations that superseded normal insurance protocols. One memo, dated 1963 and signed by the company president, was particularly explicit. "The Beaumont account represents 30% of our premium income. Mr. Beaumont's concerns about the claims process should be addressed with appropriate flexibility. Standard investigation procedures may be waived when circumstances warrant." Isabella sat back in her chair, struggling to process what she was reading. Charles Whitmore had apparently spent decades quietly documenting what appeared to be systematic insurance fraud involving some of Louisiana's most powerful families and the insurance company that employed him. But why had he never reported it? Why collect evidence for decades without taking action? The answer came in the final documents in the portfolio. A series of letters between Charles and various state insurance commissioners dating from the 1970s and 1980s. Charles had tried to report the pattern of suspicious claims, but his concerns had been dismissed or buried in bureaucratic delays. One response from a state official was particularly telling. "Mr. Whitmore, while your attention to detail is commendable, you must understand that insurance regulation involves complex considerations beyond simple claim-by-claim analysis. The families you reference have been pillars of Louisiana's economy for generations." The last letter in the series, dated 1989, was from Charles to his own son. Michael, I'm sending you copies of everything in case something happens to me. What I've discovered could change how we understand the insurance industry in Louisiana, but the people involved are too powerful to confront directly. I've decided to preserve the evidence and hope that, someday, when circumstances are different, the truth can finally come out. Isabella stared at the portfolio, her mind racing. Charles Whitmore had died 6 months ago, taking his secrets with him. His son had clearly never pursued the matter, probably dismissing his father's suspicions as the obsessions of an aging man in a conservative industry. But the safe changed everything. If Charles had spent decades collecting evidence of insurance fraud, and if he'd been secretive enough about his investigation to hide documents from his own family, what had he considered important enough to lock away in a steel vault? Isabella looked at the Mosler safe with new understanding. It wasn't just a repository for personal valuables or important documents. It was Charles Whitmore's insurance policy, his way of preserving evidence that could expose systematic fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars and some of Louisiana's most powerful families. The combination was somewhere in these files. It had to be. Charles was too meticulous, too careful to have created an impenetrable lock even for himself. Isabella returned to the portfolio, this time looking for numerical patterns, significant dates, anything that might unlock the steel vault that dominated her stockroom. It was nearly midnight when she found it. Hidden inside a folder labeled Personal Insurance Policies was a single sheet of paper with what appeared to be random numbers written in Charles's careful handwriting. But Isabella's desperate evening had taught her to recognize his notation patterns. The numbers weren't random. They were arranged in the same careful format he used for documenting claim amounts and dates. 32, 15, 47. The combination was elegant in its simplicity. The date Charles had started working for Crescent City Mutual, March 2, 1952, written in the reverse format he used for his most sensitive files. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she knelt before the safe and slowly turned the dial. Right to 32, left to 15, right to 47. The mechanism clicked, and after nearly 3/4 of a century, the steel door swung open. Inside, Isabella found Charles Whitmore's life's work. The safe contained dozens of files, each meticulously labeled and organized. Original insurance documents that Charles had apparently removed from company files before his retirement, photographs of property damage that didn't match the insurance claims, audio recordings on small cassette tapes labeled with dates and claim numbers, and, most shocking of all, financial records showing bank transfers between insurance companies and the families whose properties had suffered such remarkably profitable disasters. But it was the document on top that made Isabella's breath catch. A ledger, bound in leather and labeled True Cost, 1947 to 1987, contained Charles's careful calculations of the total fraudulent payouts he documented. The number at the bottom of the final page was written in red ink, $200,847,000. $200 million in fraudulent insurance claims processed over 4 decades, involving systematic conspiracy between Louisiana's most powerful families and the insurance companies that were supposed to regulate such activity. Isabella sat on her stockroom floor, surrounded by evidence of one of the largest insurance fraud conspiracies in American history, and realized that her financial troubles had just become the least of her concerns. Outside, Magnolia Street was quiet, in the way that only small commercial districts achieve after midnight. Inside Treasures Past, Isabella Moreau had just inherited a secret that would change everything. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to follow in Charles Whitmore's footsteps, documenting injustice while avoiding confrontation, or take the evidence he'd spent a lifetime gathering and finally demand the accountability he'd never been able to achieve. But tonight, she simply stared at the open safe and the evidence it contained, understanding that her life had just divided into 2 distinct chapters, before the safe was opened and everything that would come after. Isabella Moreau hadn't slept. Dawn crept through the dusty windows of Treasure's Past, casting pale light across the chaos of her stockroom where she sat surrounded by 7 decades of carefully preserved evidence. Empty coffee cups littered the floor around her, and her laptop screen glowed with dozens of browser tabs as she'd spent the night cross-referencing Charles Whitmore's documentation with public records, newspaper archives, and corporate filings. What she'd discovered made the $200 million figure seem conservative. The leather ledger was just the beginning. Inside the safe, Charles had preserved original insurance documents, internal company memoranda, and most damning of all, recordings of phone conversations between insurance executives and members of Louisiana's most powerful families. The cassette tapes, labeled with meticulous precision, contained hours of discussions about adjusting claim investigations, expediting payouts, and managing regulatory concerns. But it was the photographs that made Isabella's hands shake as she examined them in the morning light. Charles had somehow obtained before and after images of the properties that had suffered such profitable disasters. The 1947 Beaumont warehouse fire that had resulted in a $200,000 payout. The before photograph showed a building in obvious disrepair, with broken windows and structural damage that predated the fire. The insurance claim described it as a modern facility containing valuable merchandise. The 1952 flood damage to Rousseau shipping facilities. Charles's photograph showed that the flood-damaged warehouses had been systematically stripped of valuable contents before the supposed disaster, leaving only worthless materials to be destroyed. Most shocking was a series of photographs from 1963 showing the Beaumont family's Magnolia Street property being deliberately prepared for a fire. Men in work clothes were photographing the building's interior, cataloging contents, and, in one particularly damning image, pouring accelerant near the electrical systems of the building. Charles's research had revealed that the 1963 fire had resulted in a $400,000 payout, supposedly for destroyed antique furniture and rare books. Charles's photographs proved the valuable contents had been removed before the fire was set. She was examining a recording device Charles had somehow concealed during a 1975 meeting when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Chen, and Isabella realized with a start that she'd completely forgotten about the normal world beyond her stockroom. "Marcus, just checking in. How's the Whitmore Hall working out? My crew said that safe was a beast to move." Isabella hesitated, staring at the evidence spread around her. "It's, interesting. Listen, Marcus, what do you know about Charles Whitmore's work at Crescent City Mutual?" "Standard insurance stuff, I assume. Why?" "Did his son mention anything about his father's hobbies, interests in company history?" There was a pause. "Actually, now that you mention it, Michael did say something odd. Said his father was obsessed with old insurance files, always bringing work home. Michael thought it was just the old man being unable to let go of his career." Marcus's tone shifted. "Isabella, you sound strange. Everything okay?" "Fine," I lied. "Just curious about provenance for some of the items." After ending the call, Isabella returned to the cassette tapes. Charles had somehow obtained a recording device small enough to conceal during meetings, and over the years had documented conversations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. The first tape she played was labeled Beaumont/Crescent City, 1971, Property Assessment Discussion. The voices were clear despite the recording's age. She recognized one as belonging to Harold Beaumont, based on newspaper interviews she'd found online. The other voice belonged to someone Charles had identified as R. Thibodeau, Crescent City president. "Harold, the Magnolia Street project needs to wait another 6 months, Thibodeau was saying. The State Insurance Commission is asking questions about our claim approval rate. 6 months is unacceptable, Beaumont replied. I have buyers lined up for that property, but they won't close until the current structures are resolved. I understand the timeline pressure, but we've processed 4 major Beaumont claims this year. Even our cooperative friends at the commission are starting to notice patterns. Then perhaps it's time to diversify our approach. The Rousseau family has been eager to participate more actively in our arrangement. Let them handle the next few incidents, while Beaumont properties remain quiet. Isabella paused the tape, her mind reeling. The casual discussion of coordinated insurance fraud involving multiple families was staggering, but the reference to cooperative friends at the commission suggested the corruption extended beyond just Crescent City Mutual. The next tape was even more explicit. Recorded in 1976, it featured a 3-way conversation between Beaumont, a man identified as Laurent Rousseau, and Thibodeau discussing the expansion of their operation to include other insurance companies. The beauty of our approach, Rousseau was explaining, is that by spreading the claims across multiple insurers, we avoid the concentration that might trigger investigation. Crescent City handles the Beaumont properties, Gulf Coast Mutual covers our shipping facilities, and Pelican Insurance manages the smaller residential claims. "What's our total annual yield from this arrangement?" Beaumont asked. "Conservative estimate, $8 to $12 million per year across all 3 companies, and that's being careful not to exceed the thresholds that trigger federal attention." Isabella calculated quickly. If the operation had been generating $8 to $12 million annually from the 1970s onward, Charles's $200 million total was likely a significant underestimate. The true scope of the fraud could easily exceed $500 million when adjusted for inflation and compound interest. But the recordings revealed something even more troubling than the financial scope. This wasn't just about insurance fraud. It was about systematic economic manipulation that had shaped Louisiana's development for decades. A 1978 tape captured a conversation about using fraudulent insurance payouts to finance legitimate business investments that would position the participating families to control emerging industries. "The insurance money provides the capital base. We use the payouts to invest in shipping, real estate development, oil exploration, legitimate businesses that generate ongoing revenue streams. Within a generation, we've transformed insurance fraud into economic dynasty." The strategy was brilliantly sinister. Use fraudulent insurance claims to generate capital. Invest that capital in legitimate businesses and gradually transform criminal proceeds into generational wealth that appeared entirely lawful to outside observers. Isabella was transcribing key portions of the recordings when she heard the bell above her shop's front door chime. She glanced at her watch. 10:30 a.m. She'd been so absorbed in Charles's evidence that she'd forgotten to flip her closed sign to open. "Just a moment," she called, hastily covering the most sensitive documents and making her way to the front of the shop. A woman in her 60s stood near the vintage jewelry display, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her clothing expensive but understated. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to deference, and when she turned to face Isabella, her smile was pleasant but didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Moreau?" asked the woman, although her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I'm Margaret Beaumont. I understand you recently acquired some items from the Whitmore estate." Isabella's blood cold. Margaret Beaumont, presumably related to the Harold Beaumont featured prominently in Charles's recordings. The coincidence was impossible. Somehow, the Beaumont family had learned about her acquisition of Charles's materials. "Yes," Isabella replied carefully, "some vintage clothing and furniture pieces. Nothing too unusual. I'm particularly interested in any documents or files that might have been included. Mr. Whitmore worked for many years with companies that did business with my family. There may be historical records that belong more properly with our family archives." The request was phrased politely, but Isabella detected the underlying steel. This wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a probe to determine what she'd found and a subtle demand for its return.
"I haven't come across any business documents," Isabella lied. "Just personal papers, tax records, utility bills, that sort of thing." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Of course, though if you should discover any materials related to Crescent City Mutual or its business relationships, I hope you'll contact me immediately. Such documents often contain sensitive information that could be misinterpreted by people unfamiliar with historical insurance practices." She placed a business card on the counter, heavy stock paper with embossed lettering identifying her as Margaret Beaumont, President, Beaumont Historical Foundation. The foundation's address was one of the most prestigious locations in the Garden District. "I'm prepared to pay quite generously for any historical documents you might find. Family records, business correspondence, anything that helps preserve Louisiana's commercial heritage. $25,000 for anything substantive." $25,000, more than enough to save Isabella's shop, pay her debts, and provide breathing room for months. The offer was clearly calculated, generous enough to be tempting, specific enough to suggest that Margaret knew exactly what she was looking for. "I'll certainly keep that in mind," Isabella replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Margaret nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Moreau. The Whitmore family mentioned that Charles was rather eccentric in his later years. If you should find any unusual materials, recordings, photographs, files that seem to make serious accusations, I hope you'll remember that elderly individuals sometimes develop conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. It would be unfortunate if such materials were taken seriously and caused unnecessary distress to families whose reputations have been built over generations of legitimate business." The threat was delivered with the same pleasant smile, but its meaning was unmistakable. Margaret Beaumont knew about Charles's investigation, knew what Isabella might have discovered, and was offering her a choice: accept payment for silence or face the consequences of challenging one of Louisiana's most powerful families. After Margaret left, Isabella locked the front door and returned to her stockroom with shaking hands. The encounter proved that the Beaumont family was actively monitoring attempts to acquire Charles's evidence. But how had they known so quickly about her estate sale purchase? The answer came when she checked her phone and found 3 missed calls from Marcus Chen. When she called back, his voice was tense. "Isabella, I need to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Did you find something significant in that safe?" "Why are you asking?" "Because I just got off the phone with Michael Whitmore in Los Angeles. He says his family's attorney received a call this morning from something called the Beaumont Historical Foundation asking about materials from his father's estate. They offered to purchase any business documents for $25,000. Isabella's mind raced. The Beaumont family hadn't just learned about her acquisition. They'd traced it back through the chain of custody and were systematically trying to recover any evidence Charles might have preserved. "Marcus, I need you to be very careful about this. There may be more to Charles Whitmore's estate than just vintage clothing and furniture." "What kind of more?" Isabella hesitated. Marcus had been good to her, had helped keep her business alive through difficult times. But involving him in what she'd discovered could put him at risk from people who had demonstrated they were willing to commit serious crimes to protect their secrets. "I can't explain over the phone, but whatever you do, don't give the Beaumont Foundation any information about what was in that estate or where it went." "Isabella, you're scaring me. What did you find in that safe?" Before she could answer, the bell above her front door chimed again. Through the stockroom doorway, Isabella could see a man in an expensive suit examining her vintage jewelry display. He had the same calculated politeness she'd noticed in Margaret Beaumont, the bearing of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted. "I have to go," she whispered to Marcus. "Don't talk to anyone else about the Whitmore estate." Isabella ended the call and approached her second unexpected visitor of the day, already suspecting this wouldn't be a coincidence either. "Good morning," the man said, his voice carrying a slight French accent that suggested old Louisiana family connections. "I am Laurent Rousseau, Jr. I believe Margaret Beaumont may have spoken with you earlier about historical documents from the Whitmore estate." "She mentioned an interest in historical materials," Isabella replied carefully. Laurent nodded, his expression serious. "Miss Moreau, I am going to be more direct than Margaret was because I believe directness serves everyone's interests better. We know Charles Whitmore spent decades collecting materials related to insurance claims from the 1940s through the 1980s. We know he was suspicious of certain business practices, though his suspicions were unfounded. He moved closer to the counter, his tone becoming more intimate and threatening simultaneously. We also know that such materials, if taken out of context, could create serious problems for families whose reputations have been built over generations of legitimate business. Problems that would inevitably extend to anyone who possessed or distributed such materials." The threat was less subtle than Margaret's had been. Laurent was making it clear that challenging the families involved wouldn't just result in legal difficulties, it could become dangerous. "Now, I'm authorized to offer $50,000 for any materials you may have acquired from the Whitmore estate. Documents, recordings, photographs, anything that touches on historical insurance practices. This is a generous offer that would solve your immediate financial difficulties and allow you to continue operating your business without complications." $50,000, twice what Margaret had offered, suggesting competition between the families or recognition that Isabella's cooperation was crucial to containing the situation. "And if I don't have such materials?" Isabella asked. Laurent's smile was cold. "Then you have nothing to worry about. But if such materials exist and were to surface inappropriately, the consequences would be severe, not just for the families involved, but for anyone who chose to misinterpret historical business practices." After Laurent left, Isabella sat in her stockroom surrounded by evidence that could destroy some of Louisiana's most powerful families, and realized she was facing the same choice that had paralyzed Charles Whitmore for decades. She could accept the money. $50,000 would save her shop and provide security she'd never known. The families were offering her a way out that would solve her immediate problems and allow her to return to her quiet life, selling vintage clothing to tourists and collectors. Or she could follow through on Charles's decades of investigation and expose systematic fraud that had shaped Louisiana's economic development for generations, knowing that doing so would put her in direct conflict with people who had demonstrated both the resources and willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them. The afternoon brought two more visitors that made her choice even more complicated. The first was Detective Ray Broussard of the Louisiana State Police, Economic Crimes Division. A tall, lean man in his 40s with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to complex financial investigations, he introduced himself with credentials and a business card. "Miss Moreau, I'm following up on some information we received about potential historical insurance irregularities. I understand you recently acquired materials from the estate of Charles Whitmore, who worked for Crescent City Mutual for many years." Isabella studied the detective carefully. His presence could mean that someone, possibly Charles's son or another family member, had finally decided to report the old man's suspicions. Or it could mean that her morning visitors had decided to involve law enforcement as a way to control the situation. What kind of information? Without going into details, we've received reports suggesting that Mr. Whitmore may have preserved evidence related to insurance claim irregularities dating back several decades. If such evidence exists, it would be of significant interest to ongoing investigations. Ongoing investigations? Broussard nodded. Federal authorities have been examining patterns in historical insurance claims throughout Louisiana. Mr. Whitmore's materials, if they exist, could provide crucial historical context for understanding how certain practices developed over time. The detective's careful language suggested he was aware of the sensitive nature of what he was discussing. The mention of federal involvement indicated the investigation was more serious than Isabella had realized. If I were to have such materials, what would be the proper procedure? Any evidence of potential insurance fraud would need to be turned over to appropriate authorities for authentication and investigation. In return, individuals providing such evidence would receive full protection under whistleblower statutes, including personal security if circumstances warranted. The offer of protection was both reassuring and terrifying. It suggested that the authorities understood the potential dangers involved, but also that those dangers were real and serious. After Detective Broussard left, Isabella spent the afternoon reviewing Charles's evidence with new understanding. His decades of documentation weren't just about insurance fraud. They represented systematic economic crimes that had shaped Louisiana's development for generations. The families involved hadn't just stolen money from insurance companies. They had used fraudulent claims to generate capital for legitimate investments that had given them control over shipping, real estate, oil exploration, and banking throughout the region. Their economic power, built on criminal foundations, had allowed them to influence political processes, regulatory decisions, and law enforcement actions for decades. Charles had documented not just the original crimes, but the ongoing pattern of using criminal proceeds to build legitimate economic empires that appeared entirely lawful to outside observers. His final visitor of the day made the stakes crystal clear. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at closing time, introducing herself as a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crime Task Force. A small woman in her 30s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years unraveling complex financial conspiracies.
Miss Moreau, we understand you may have acquired materials that could be relevant to a federal investigation into historical insurance fraud in Louisiana. This investigation has been ongoing for 2 years, and we believe Mr. Whitmore's documentation could provide the missing pieces we need to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Isabella realized she was at the center of something far larger than she'd imagined. Federal investigators had been building a case against the families for years, and Charles's evidence could provide the historical foundation they needed to prove systematic criminal activity. "What happens if I cooperate?" Isabella asked. "Full federal protection, relocation assistance if necessary, and substantial financial compensation under the federal whistleblower program. Based on preliminary estimates of the fraud involved, your compensation could exceed $1 million. And if I don't cooperate?" Dr. Vasquez's expression was grave. "The families involved have demonstrated willingness to use intimidation, legal pressure, and potentially more serious measures to protect their interests. Without federal protection, anyone possessing evidence of their activities would be extremely vulnerable." As evening fell over Magnolia Street, Isabella sat alone in her stockroom, surrounded by Charles Whitmore's life work and facing the most important decision of her life. The evidence was overwhelming. The cassette recordings, photographs, and financial documents proved systematic insurance fraud involving hundreds of millions of dollars over 4 decades. The conspiracy had shaped Louisiana's economic development, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of families willing to commit serious crimes to maintain their positions. Charles Whitmore had spent his career quietly documenting these crimes, but had been too intimidated by the power of the families involved to take action. He'd preserved the evidence and hoped that someday circumstances would change enough to allow the truth to emerge.
Now, those circumstances had changed. Federal investigators were actively building cases against the families. State authorities were examining patterns in historical insurance claims. The political and legal environment had shifted enough to make exposure of the conspiracy possible. But exposure would require Isabella to risk everything, her safety, her business, her quiet life, to confront people who had demonstrated both the resources and willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them. As she locked the safe and prepared to close her shop, Isabella realized that Charles Whitmore had done more than preserve evidence of historical crimes. He had created an opportunity for justice that would never come again. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to seize that opportunity or allow another generation to pass while the families continued to profit from their criminal legacy. The weight of that decision kept her awake through another sleepless night, surrounded by evidence that could change everything if she had the courage to use it. Tomorrow would bring consequences she couldn't yet imagine, as the most powerful families in Louisiana realized that their carefully guarded secrets were no longer safe in Charles Whitmore's steel vault. Don't miss Part 3, where Isabella makes her fateful decision and discovers just how far the conspiracy reaches and how dangerous the people protecting it are willing to become. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens when she finally decides to open Charles's safe to the world. Isabella's decision crystallized at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, triggered not by courage or moral conviction, but by the sound of someone trying to pick the lock on her shop's back door. She'd been sleeping fitfully on the small couch in her office, unwilling to leave Charles Whitmore's evidence unguarded after yesterday's parade of visitors. The soft scratching of metal against metal jerked her fully awake, and she lay frozen in the darkness, listening to the methodical sounds of someone with professional lock-picking skills working their way through her security. Isabella's phone was in her hand before she fully realized she'd grabbed it, but as she started to dial 911, she hesitated. The intruder wasn't rushing. This was careful, patient work. Someone who wanted to avoid detection was likely not to harm her if they could simply retrieve what they came for and disappear. But calling the police would create an official record of the break-in, which might complicate her options with both the families offering bribes and the federal investigators seeking cooperation. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn silence. Isabella crept to the stockroom doorway, positioning herself where she could see the back entrance without being visible to whoever was entering. A small penlight beam swept methodically across the room, pausing on the open safe and the scattered documents she'd left on her work table. The intruder was a woman, small, athletic, dressed in dark clothing that suggested professional rather than opportunistic criminal activity. She moved with the confidence of someone familiar with covert operations, photographing documents with a high-end camera that worked silently in low-light conditions. Isabella watched as the woman systematically documented every piece of evidence Charles had preserved, paying particular attention to the cassette recordings and the leather ledger with its $200 million calculation. The intrusion was thorough, but careful. Nothing was disturbed or taken, just recorded for later analysis.
After 20 minutes, the woman collected her equipment and departed as silently as she'd arrived, leaving the back door locked behind her. Isabella remained motionless for another 10 minutes, processing what she'd witnessed. Someone, presumably working for the Beaumont or Rousseau families, had conducted professional surveillance of Charles's evidence. They now knew exactly what he'd preserved and could plan the response accordingly. The break-in changed the entire dynamic of Isabella's situation, proving that the families were willing to commit serious crimes to assess and contain the threat. But it also clarified her choice. People who broke into buildings and photographed evidence weren't planning to negotiate indefinitely. The offers of money were temporary measures while they evaluated the scope of the problem. Once they understood what Charles had documented, they would shift to more permanent solutions. Isabella spent the remaining hours until dawn, reviewing Charles's evidence one final time, this time focusing not on the insurance fraud itself, but on the pattern of intimidation and violence he documented against anyone who had previously threatened the conspiracy. In 1958, an insurance investigator named Thomas Landry had begun asking questions about the pattern of Beaumont family claims. Landry had died in what was ruled an accidental drowning, but Charles had preserved newspaper clippings suggesting that Landry had been receiving threats before his death. In 1967, a state insurance examiner named Patricia Dugas had attempted to audit Crescent City Mutual's claim approval processes. She'd been transferred to a different department and then fired for performance issues before completing her investigation. In 1974, a journalist named Robert Chen had been researching connections between Louisiana's prominent families and suspicious insurance payouts. His investigation ended abruptly when he was arrested on fabricated drug charges and lost his job. The pattern was consistent and chilling. Anyone who came close to exposing the conspiracy faced escalating pressure, job loss, legal problems, public humiliation, and, at least in one case, possible murder. Charles Whitmore had understood this pattern, which explained why he'd spent decades collecting evidence without taking action. He'd been afraid to confront people who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them. But Charles had also understood something else that became clear as Isabella read his final notes from the 1980s. The family's power wasn't absolute. It depended on maintaining secrecy and avoiding federal attention. If the evidence ever reached federal investigators with the resources and authority to pursue it properly, the conspiracy would collapse. The key, Charles had written in his final ledger entry, is timing and preparation. This evidence must reach federal authorities simultaneously with media coverage, making it impossible to suppress through intimidation or corruption of local officials. When the time is right, everything must be revealed at once, giving the families no opportunity to contain the damage. Isabella realized that Charles had been waiting for the right moment, a time when federal authorities were actively investigating insurance fraud and media attention would ensure the evidence couldn't be buried. That time had finally arrived. At 8 a.m., Isabella made 3 calls that would transform her from struggling vintage shop owner to federal witness. The first call was to Dr. Elena Vasquez at the FBI. Dr. Vasquez, this is Isabella Moreau. I'm ready to cooperate fully with your investigation, but I need guarantees of protection, and I need everything to happen immediately. Someone broke into my shop last night and photographed all of Charles Whitmore's evidence. The families involved know exactly what I have, and I don't think I have much time before they try to stop me permanently. Vasquez's response was immediate and professional. Ms. Moreau, I'm dispatching agents to your location now. Don't leave your shop, don't communicate with anyone else, and don't touch any of the evidence. We'll have you in protective custody within the hour. The second call was to Detective Ray Broussard at the state police. Detective Broussard, I want to report a federal crime and request immediate coordination with FBI investigators who are already en route to my location. I have evidence of systematic insurance fraud involving the Beaumont and Rousseau families dating back to the 1940s. The evidence includes recordings, photographs, and financial documents proving fraudulent insurance claims totaling over $200 million. Broussard's reaction was more cautious than Vasquez's had been. Miss Moreau, that's a serious accusation involving some very prominent families. Are you certain about what you're alleging? Detective, I have recordings of Harold Beaumont and Laurent Rousseau discussing the coordination of fraudulent insurance claims with executives from Crescent City Mutual. I have photographs showing properties being prepared for deliberate destruction. I have financial records documenting the transfer of fraudulent insurance payouts into legitimate business investments. And I have evidence that anyone who previously tried to investigate this conspiracy faced intimidation, career destruction, or worse. The line was silent for several seconds. I'll coordinate with the federal agents and meet you at your location.
The third call was to Margot, her sister in Baton Rouge. Margot, I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm finished. I'm about to become a federal witness in a major criminal investigation. I'll probably be in protective custody for weeks or months. I need you to contact the media, the Times-Picayune, the Advocate, maybe some national outlets, and tell them that tomorrow there's going to be a major announcement about historical insurance fraud in Louisiana, involving some of the state's most powerful families. Isabella, what the hell are you talking about? I found evidence that some of Louisiana's wealthiest families have been committing insurance fraud for decades. I'm turning it over to federal investigators, but I need media attention to make sure the story can't be buried. Can you help me with that?" Margot's voice shifted from confusion to concern. "Isabella, are you in danger?" "Probably, but I'm about to be in federal protection, and this is the right thing to do. These people have been stealing money and destroying lives for generations. Someone has to stop them." By 9 a.m., Isabella's quiet vintage shop had been transformed into the center of a federal investigation. FBI agents had secured the building and begun the meticulous process of cataloging and photographing Charles Whitmore's evidence. Dr. Vasquez supervised the operation, while Detective Broussard coordinated with state authorities. "Miss Moreau," Vasquez explained as agents worked around them, "based on our preliminary review, this evidence is more significant than we anticipated. Mr. Whitmore documented not just insurance fraud, but a systematic conspiracy to manipulate Louisiana's economic development through criminal activity. This investigation is going to expand far beyond insurance claims." Isabella watched agents carefully package the cassette recordings that would destroy some of Louisiana's most powerful families. "What happens to me now?" "Immediate relocation to a secure federal facility while we authenticate the evidence and prepare cases. Based on the scope of what you're providing, the families involved will face federal racketeering charges, conspiracy charges, and decades of prison sentences. They'll have strong incentives to prevent you from testifying." "How long will the protection last?" "Until the trials are concluded and any appeal periods have expired, probably 2 to 3 years minimum." The magnitude of what Isabella had committed herself to was staggering. 3 years in federal protection, followed by permanent relocation and a new identity if necessary. Her quiet life selling vintage clothing in Bellhaven was ending permanently. But as she watched agents document evidence of crimes that had shaped Louisiana's development for generations, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose larger than her own immediate concerns. The morning's activity was interrupted by the arrival of 2 men in expensive suits who identified themselves as attorneys representing the Beaumont and Rousseau families. They requested immediate access to their clients' historical business documents that had been improperly acquired from the Whitmore estate. Dr. Vasquez's response was professionally polite and absolutely final. "Gentlemen, the materials in question are now evidence in a federal criminal investigation. Any further contact with Miss Moreau or attempts to interfere with this investigation will result in additional federal charges." The attorneys retreated, but their presence confirmed that the families were already mobilizing legal resources to contain the damage. The break-in had given them advance warning, allowing them to prepare defensive strategies. By noon, the first media reports had begun appearing online. Margot had been effective in her outreach, and reporters were already calling Isabella's shop, seeking comment on reports of a significant insurance fraud investigation involving historical Louisiana business practices. The story was breaking exactly as Charles Whitmore had envisioned. Federal investigation coordinated with media attention, making it impossible for the families to suppress through intimidation or corruption of local officials. Isabella's afternoon was spent in detailed interviews with federal agents, walking them through Charles's evidence and explaining the context of each recording and document. The scope of the investigation expanded with each revelation. The fraudulent insurance claims were just the foundation, Agent Sarah Morrison explained during a break in the interviews. The families used that money to build legitimate business empires that gave them control over shipping, real estate, banking, and political influence throughout Louisiana. We're looking at a conspiracy that shaped the state's economic development for decades. What about the people who tried to investigate before? Thomas Landry, Patricia Dugas, Robert Chen. Morrison's expression was grim. We'll be reopening those cases as part of the racketeering investigation. If the families eliminated people who threatened them, that transforms this from financial crime to organized criminal conspiracy, including murder.
By evening, Isabella was in a secure federal facility outside New Orleans, watching news coverage of the biggest criminal investigation in Louisiana's history. The story had gone national, with major networks sending reporters to cover what commentators were calling the insurance scandal that built a dynasty. The family's response was swift and coordinated. Margaret Beaumont appeared on local television dismissing the accusations as malicious attacks on Louisiana families who have contributed to the state's development for generations. She characterized Charles Whitmore as an elderly man whose mental decline led him to develop elaborate conspiracy theories with no basis in reality. Laurent Rousseau Jr. issued a written statement describing the investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt based on forged documents and fabricated evidence. He announced that his family was filing defamation lawsuits against media outlets reporting on the accusations. But the family's defensive strategies couldn't overcome the overwhelming evidence Charles had preserved. The cassette recordings were particularly damaging. Hours of conversations between family members and insurance executives discussing the coordination of fraudulent claims in their own voices. Dr. Vasquez visited Isabella that evening to update her on the investigation's rapid progress. The authentication process is proceeding faster than usual because Mr. Whitmore's documentation is so thorough. He included metadata, chain of custody records, and verification materials that prove the authenticity of everything he preserved. It's some of the most meticulous evidence collection I've seen in 30 years of federal investigations. What's the timeline for charges? Federal grand jury convenes Monday. We expect the first indictments within 2 weeks, with additional charges as we expand the investigation to include the historical cases of intimidation and possible murder. Isabella stared out the window of her secure facility, watching the lights of New Orleans in the distance. Dr. Vasquez, do you think I made the right choice? 3 years of my life in protective custody, permanent relocation, never being able to return to the life I built in Bellhaven? Vasquez followed her gaze toward the city lights. Ms. Moreau, the evidence you provided is going to result in the recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent proceeds that can be returned to the insurance companies and their policyholders. The families involved will lose their illegitimate business empires and face decades in federal prison. And most importantly, will prevent them from continuing to commit crimes that have been destroying lives for generations. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I won't lie to you. The next few years will be difficult, and your life will never be the same. The question is whether you can live with the knowledge that you had the opportunity to stop systematic criminal activity and chose not to take it. Isabella thought about Charles Whitmore, who had spent decades collecting evidence but had been too intimidated to use it. She thought about Thomas Landry, who had died trying to investigate the conspiracy. She thought about all the families who had suffered financial hardship because of fraudulent insurance practices that had concentrated wealth in the hands of criminals. I can live with the consequences of stopping them, she said finally. I couldn't live with the consequences of letting it continue. That night, alone in her secure room, Isabella reviewed the news coverage of the investigation she had triggered. Federal agents were executing search warrants at Beaumont and Rousseau properties throughout Louisiana. Banking records were being subpoenaed. Historical cases were being reopened. The quiet vintage shop owner who had stumbled onto Charles Whitmore's evidence had become the catalyst for dismantling a criminal conspiracy that had shaped Louisiana's development for generations. But as she prepared for sleep in her federal protection facility, Isabella understood that she had only completed the first phase of a much longer journey. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a legal process that would consume years of her life and put her in direct confrontation with some of the most powerful and dangerous people in Louisiana. The families whose empire she was destroying had already demonstrated their willingness to commit serious crimes to protect their interests. As federal charges multiplied and their legitimate businesses faced seizure, their incentives to silence her would only increase. Isabella opened Charles Whitmore's safe and found the evidence that would bring justice for decades of criminal activity. But she had also found herself at the center of a war between truth and power that was only just beginning. The phone beside her bed rang at exactly midnight, a secure line that only federal agents were supposed to have access to. When she answered, the voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear. Is Moreau, "You have made a serious mistake. Federal protection is temporary. Our reach is permanent. Consider this your final opportunity to reconsider your cooperation with this investigation." Isabella hung up without responding, but sleep didn't come easily. The families had somehow accessed her secure communication line within hours of her entering federal protection. Their resources and connections were more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the criminal conspiracy she had exposed began fighting back with everything they had built through decades of criminal activity. The safe that changed everything was now empty, its secrets transformed from hidden evidence into federal prosecution. But the real battle for justice was just beginning.
The threatening phone call had been traced within 6 hours, leading federal investigators down a rabbit hole of corruption that extended far beyond insurance fraud. The call had been routed through a secure communication system used by the Louisiana State Police, a system that required high-level authorization to access. Someone with significant government connections was feeding information to the Beaumont and Rousseau families, and they were using official law enforcement infrastructure to intimidate federal witnesses. Isabella learned this during her morning briefing with Dr. Elena Vasquez and a new face, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, who had been assigned to lead the prosecution of what was now being called Operation Clean Slate. Ms. Moreau, Torres explained as they sat in the secure conference room of her protection facility, the investigation has expanded beyond what anyone anticipated. The families didn't just commit insurance fraud, they used the proceeds to purchase political influence at every level of Louisiana government. We're looking at systematic corruption involving judges, prosecutors, state legislators, and law enforcement officials. Isabella absorbed this information with growing unease. "Are you saying the people who are supposed to protect me might be working for the families I'm testifying against?" "We're saying we can't trust anyone in Louisiana law enforcement or state government until we determine the extent of the corruption. That's why you're being transferred to a federal facility in Texas while we sort out who can be trusted." The relocation happened that afternoon, with Isabella transported by federal marshals to a secure facility outside Houston. The move emphasized how seriously federal authorities were taking the threat, but it also underscored her complete dependence on people she barely knew for her survival. During the flight, Isabella reviewed the morning's news coverage, which had exploded beyond Louisiana to national attention. The New York Times had published a front-page story titled "Louisiana Dynasty Built on Insurance Fraud," while CNN was running hourly updates on what anchors called the biggest corruption scandal in Southern history. But the media attention had also triggered a coordinated counterattack that demonstrated the family's extensive resources and political connections. Governor Patricia Landry, whose surname had caught Isabella's attention as potentially related to Thomas Landry, the insurance investigator who had died in 1958, held a press conference denouncing the federal investigation as an attack on Louisiana's business community based on fabricated evidence and the delusions of a mentally unstable elderly man. The governor's statement was significant not just for its content, but for its timing. Federal authorities hadn't released details about Charles Whitmore's mental state or the specific nature of the evidence. Governor Landry's knowledge of investigative details suggested she had access to information that should have been restricted to federal investigators. "She's either getting briefings from someone inside the investigation," Torres observed during the flight, "or the families have connections high enough to access federal case files." Isabella's new facility in Texas was a dramatic upgrade in security, a converted military installation with multiple layers of protection and communication systems that couldn't be compromised by state-level corruption. But the enhanced security also emphasized the escalating danger. Over the following weeks, federal investigators worked methodically to authenticate Charles Whitmore's evidence while building cases against the families and their network of corrupt officials. The breakthrough came when Charles Whitmore's son, Michael, initially dismissive of his father's suspicions, contacted federal investigators after receiving death threats. He provided materials his father had mailed to him years ago as insurance policies, recordings of meetings with federal officials in the 1980s who had buried Charles's reports about the conspiracy. The recordings prove systematic obstruction of justice by multiple federal officials over 4 decades. We now have evidence that transforms this from a regional corruption case to a federal racketeering case involving some of the highest levels of government, Torres explained during a secure briefing. But as the investigation expanded, so did the danger to witnesses. The families demonstrated resources that reached into federal agencies, compromising multiple levels of security. Isabella was relocated 3 more times as her locations were repeatedly discovered through channels that should have been secure. The final relocation took her to a facility that existed off all official records, a black site operated for witnesses whose cases involved threats to national security. In a converted ranch in rural Montana, Isabella found herself under the protection of personnel whose identities couldn't be verified through normal channels.
Ms. Moreau, her new coordinator, explained, "You're now in a program that doesn't officially exist, protected by people whose backgrounds can't be verified. That's the level of security your case requires." The isolation provided time for Isabella to work with federal analysts, tracing connections between the insurance fraud she'd discovered and the broader criminal enterprise it had spawned. The pattern was elegant and horrifying. Fraudulent insurance claims had provided startup capital for a criminal empire that now controlled significant portions of Louisiana's government and federal representation. But the family's counterattack intensified as federal charges multiplied. Senator James Beaumont called for congressional hearings into federal investigative overreach. Representative Marie Rousseau introduced legislation restricting federal authority over historical business practices. Federal Judge Robert Thibault issued injunctions that severely limited investigators' access to evidence. "They're using their political connections to strangle the investigation," Torres explained during a secure video conference. "Every legal mechanism we try to use is being blocked by federal officials who owe their positions to the families we're investigating." As autumn arrived in Montana, Isabella watched from her secure facility as the case reached its climax. Federal grand juries had been convened in 3 states. International banking authorities were freezing assets in 12 countries. Media coverage had spread globally as the story revealed how systematic criminal activity could infiltrate democratic institutions. The first indictments were unsealed on a Tuesday morning in November. 127 federal charges against 34 defendants, including members of both families, insurance company executives, state officials, and federal representatives. The RICO prosecution alleged a criminal enterprise that had operated for over 70 years, generating more than $800 million in criminal proceeds. Margaret Beaumont was arrested at her Garden District mansion, led away in handcuffs as media crews filmed from behind police barriers. Laurent Rousseau Jr. was taken into custody at his office, his attempts to claim diplomatic immunity denied by federal judges. But the most shocking arrests came in Washington, D.C., where Senator James Beaumont and Representative Marie Rousseau were charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. Federal Judge Robert Thibault was arrested in his chambers, accused of taking bribes to manipulate federal court proceedings. Isabella watched the news coverage from Montana, finally understanding the full scope of what Charles Whitmore had preserved in his steel safe. The insurance fraud had just been the foundation for a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated American democratic institutions at their highest levels. The trials began the following spring, with Isabella's testimony serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Under intense security, she spent 6 weeks on the witness stand, walking federal juries through Charles Whitmore's evidence and explaining how a chance discovery in a vintage shop had revealed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history. The defense strategy focused on attacking Charles's mental state and questioning the authenticity of decades-old evidence.
But the systematic nature of his documentation and the corroborating testimony of other witnesses proved overwhelming. Margaret Beaumont was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. Laurent Rousseau Jr. received 42 years. Senator Beaumont and Representative Rousseau were each sentenced to 25 years and expelled from Congress. Judge Thibault received 30 years and was removed from the federal bench. In total, 31 defendants were convicted, with sentences ranging from 8 to 45 years in federal prison. The criminal enterprise's assets were seized under federal forfeiture laws, generating more than $2.3 billion for distribution to victims and affected insurance companies. But the most significant impact was institutional. The case led to comprehensive reforms in insurance regulation, judicial oversight, and congressional ethics. New systems were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic infiltration that the families had achieved over decades of patient corruption. For Isabella, the conclusion of the trials brought both relief and profound change. After 18 months in federal protection, she was offered a new identity and relocation to any city in America, with financial compensation that would ensure her security for life. She chose Portland, Oregon, where she opened a small bookstore specializing in historical true crime. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had stumbled on to one of the greatest criminal conspiracies in history now spent her days selling books about other people's investigations into systematic corruption. The store, called Hidden Truth Books, became a gathering place for writers, researchers, and activists interested in exposing institutional corruption. Isabella never discussed her own role in the Louisiana case, maintaining the anonymity that federal protection required, but she quietly supported others who were fighting similar battles against entrenched criminal power. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes think about Charles Whitmore, the meticulous insurance adjuster who had spent decades documenting crimes he was too intimidated to expose. His patient work had finally achieved justice, though he hadn't lived to see the criminal empire dismantled. The vintage shop in Bellhaven had been sold while Isabella was in protection, the proceeds donated to a foundation supporting families affected by insurance fraud. The building now housed a small museum documenting the history of systematic corruption in Louisiana, with Charles Whitmore's story serving as the centerpiece of the permanent exhibition.
Isabella's old life selling vintage clothing to tourists seemed impossibly distant from her new reality, but she had found peace in understanding that some discoveries are too important to ignore, regardless of the personal cost. The brass key that had unlocked Charles Whitmore's safe now sat in a place of honor in her Portland bookstore, a reminder that truth, once released, has power that no amount of wealth or political influence can ultimately contain. Sometimes customers would ask about the key, displayed in a simple frame behind the counter. Isabella would smile and explain that it belonged to someone who had been very patient and very brave and had helped ensure that justice finally prevailed over systematic criminal activity. She never mentioned that the same key had unlocked her own transformation from struggling business owner to federal witness, or that opening one safe had revealed secrets powerful enough to reshape American understanding of institutional corruption. The safe that had changed everything was now empty, its secrets transformed from hidden evidence into historical record. But its legacy continued in the reforms that prevented similar criminal infiltration and in the reminder that individual courage, combined with meticulous documentation, could overcome even the most entrenched criminal power. Charles Whitmore's patience had finally been rewarded. Isabella's courage had ensured his evidence reached the light, and together they had proven that truth, carefully preserved and courageously revealed, remains more powerful than the corruption it exposes. The story that began with a reluctant inheritance and the locked safe had ended with justice for victims spanning generations and reforms that would protect future generations from similar systematic criminal activity. Sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that demand the greatest courage to claim. This concludes our incredible journey from a struggling vintage shop to the corridors of federal power.
showing how one person's discovery can expose systematic corruption and change history. Thank you for following Isabella's remarkable story. And remember, truth has a way of surfacing when the time is right, but it takes courage to ensure it reaches the light. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with others who believe that individual actions can still make a difference in fighting institutional corruption. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice waiting for the right person to turn the right key at exactly the right moment. 2 years after the trials concluded, Isabella Moreau stood in her Portland bookstore watching the morning news report about the final asset seizure from the Beaumont-Rousseau criminal enterprise. The reporter announced that federal authorities had recovered an additional $400 million in hidden offshore accounts, bringing the total recovery to nearly $3 billion. The conclusion of Operation Clean Slate represents one of the largest criminal asset forfeitures in U.S. history, the anchor explained. Funds will be distributed to insurance companies and policyholders who were defrauded over 7 decades of systematic criminal activity. Isabella muted the television and returned to unpacking a shipment of books about white-collar crime. The irony of her new profession wasn't lost on her. The woman who had accidentally exposed one of America's largest criminal conspiracies now spent her days selling books about other people's investigations. The brass key from Charles Whitmore's safe sat in its frame behind the counter, catching the morning light streaming through the bookstore's windows. Customers sometimes asked about it, and Isabella would explain that it had belonged to someone very patient who had helped ensure justice finally prevailed. She never mentioned her own role in the story. The bell above her door chimed, and Isabella looked up to see Dr. Elena Vasquez entering the shop. The former FBI agent had retired 6 months earlier and was visiting Portland as part of a speaking tour about corruption investigations. "Isabella," Vasquez smiled, approaching the counter. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I wanted to see how you were settling into your new life." Isabella gestured around the cozy bookstore with its carefully curated sections on investigative journalism, legal history, and true crime. "It's quiet, peaceful, very different from federal protection." "Any regrets about the path you chose?" Isabella considered the question as she had many times over the past 2 years. "Dr. Vasquez, do you know what happened to Thomas Landry's family, the insurance investigator who died in 1958? His widow struggled financially for decades after his death. The insurance company denied his benefits, claiming he'd violated company policies. His children never knew their father had been investigating criminal activity. They just knew he'd died young and left them in poverty. And Patricia Duas, the state examiner who was fired for asking questions, never worked in insurance again, spent the rest of her career as a clerk in a department store despite having an accounting degree. The families made sure she was blacklisted from any position where she might cause problems." Isabella nodded. "That's why I don't have regrets. Charles Whitmore spent 40 years collecting evidence because he was too afraid to use it. I had the opportunity to finish what he started." Vasquez examined the bookstore's displays, noting the emphasis on stories of institutional corruption and the individuals who had exposed it. "The reforms that came out of your case are already preventing similar conspiracies. New oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements, cross-agency coordination protocols, the kind of systematic criminal infiltration the families achieved would be much harder to accomplish now."
Isabella was now free to resume her previous identity as she chose, or to continue living under the new identity she'd established in Portland. The letter emphasized that the choice was entirely hers, and that federal support would continue regardless of her decision. She had already made her choice months earlier. The quiet bookstore owner in Portland bore little resemblance to the desperate vintage shop proprietor who had stumbled onto Charles Whitmore's evidence. The woman who had testified against one of America's most powerful criminal conspiracies had found peace in a simpler life devoted to supporting others who were fighting similar battles against institutional corruption. As evening approached, Isabella locked the brass key back in its frame and prepared to close Hidden Truth books for the day.
The small bookstore had become more than a business. It was a gathering place for people who believed that individual actions could still make a difference in exposing systematic wrongdoing. Charles Whitmore's safe was now empty, its secrets transformed from hidden evidence into historical record. The criminal empire built on insurance fraud had been dismantled, its assets distributed to victims, its leaders imprisoned for decades. But the most important legacy wasn't the monetary recovery or the institutional reforms. It was the reminder that truth, carefully preserved and courageously revealed, remains more powerful than the corruption it exposes. Isabella turned off the lights and looked once more at the brass key behind her counter. Tomorrow would bring new customers seeking books about corruption and justice, writers researching their own investigations, activists planning their own challenges to institutional power. The key that unlocked Charles Whitmore's evidence had also unlocked Isabella's understanding of her own capacity for courage. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones that demand the greatest bravery to claim. And sometimes the smallest actions, opening an estate sale safe, refusing a bribe, choosing justice over safety, can reshape history. The safe that changed everything was empty now, but its legacy continued in every person who chose truth over comfort, justice over security, and courage over silence. Charles Whitmore's patience had finally been rewarded. Isabella's courage had ensured his evidence reached the light. Together, they had proven that systematic criminal activity, no matter how entrenched, remains vulnerable to the power of individual conscience combined with meticulous documentation. The story that began with a reluctant inheritance ended with justice for victims spanning generations and reforms that would protect future generations from similar systematic criminal activity. In the end, the greatest treasure hadn't been hidden in the safe. It had been the courage to open it.